In the silent hum of a data center outside Zurich, markets pulse in red and green, lifelines of nations compressed into digital streams. But before the algorithms came her, Eleanor Voss, a strategist who wrote the unspoken rules of modern finance and then vanished. Her story begins long before fiber optics, when trades were made by phone and courage was the only collateral. As the world chased visible power, she built an invisible empire, reshaping currencies, economies, and the men who thought they ruled them. Every rate cut, every oil surge, every quiet bailout, her fingerprints linger. To the few who knew, she wasn't just an analyst. She was the quiet architect of confidence itself, the force that steadied markets when the world shook. Long before headlines or algorithms, Eleanor learned the rhythm of power, patience. She wasn't born into wealth. She was born into observation. Her father lost everything in a bond collapse, and from that ruin she learned that markets are not mathematics. They are psychology written in numbers. When she arrived at the London School of Economics, her professors dismissed her models as too intuitive. Decades later, those same equations would be taught as market stabilization theory. She never sought applause, only precision. When markets crashed in '87, the world panicked. Eleanor didn't. She locked herself in a quiet office, drew a line on a yellow pad, and whispered, "This is where fear ends." The next morning, her memo circulated through 5 investment banks. The market stabilized, not because she was right, but because she sounded certain. They called her the ghost advisor. Governments consulted her through intermediaries. Banks traded on her silence. Yet she lived simply, one apartment, one fountain pen, one unlisted phone. Power to her was not possession but proximity. The art of staying unseen while everything moved around her. Every empire leaves a signature, some written in marble, others in code. Eleanor's was written in the markets themselves. To this day, when currencies resist collapse and nations recover from unseen tremors, her models still whisper beneath the algorithms. She remains invisible, but her mathematics breathe through every trade, every decision, every act of faith in a number. Power rarely announces itself. It whispers through decisions so small they seem harmless. A sentence in a memo, a hesitation in a meeting, a phone call at midnight. In the late 1980s, Eleanor Voss discovered that markets didn't need force. They needed choreography. Her genius was invisible, not in predicting movements, but in guiding those who believed they moved freely. She learned that control meant never appearing to have it. Her silence became currency, her restraint a weapon. Those who underestimated her never realized they were already part of her design. The men around her believed she was deciphering numbers. In truth, she was studying them, their habits, their voices, their blind spots. While they saw markets, she saw patterns of emotion disguised as logic. Each decision they made revealed fear, disguised as confidence, greed dressed as foresight. Her quiet was deliberate. It made others speak more, expose more. Soon, their empires began to depend on her pauses more than their profits. By the early 1990s, she began writing private reports under aliases, papers that reshaped entire banking doctrines. "Capital flows like water," one began, "and I have learned where the dams leak." She watched her theories published under other names, smiled faintly, and continued writing. Reputation was a risk, obscurity a fortress. She built networks, not of people, but of dependencies. Banks leaned on her models. Ministers leaned on those banks. Nations leaned on those ministers. Every link in the chain believed it led upward. Unaware, she held the quiet fulcrum. In that balance, she found purpose, and the faint dread of knowing how fragile control truly was. The moment she realized her theories no longer belonged to her came quietly, An unsigned fax at dawn, marked classified. Inside, her own model, modified, weaponized. A global institution would soon use it to control liquidity across entire continents. She stared at the page until sunrise, understanding that influence, once released, never returns. The architect had lost the blueprint to her own design. When control becomes habit, it ceases to feel like power. It becomes burden. By the end of the 1990s, Eleanor had watched her equations spread across continents like untraceable whispers. Each formula she'd written to stabilize markets was now used to manipulate them. She saw nations borrow illusions and call them growth. Her calls went unanswered. The students she once mentored now sat on boards that no longer remembered her name. Still, she remained silent, believing that influence without presence was purity, not realizing it was erasure in progress. When the Asian financial crisis erupted, she knew the numbers long before the headlines. Watching from Zurich, she traced panic across her old algorithms like veins lighting up under ultraviolet. This wasn't collapse. It was a rehearsal for something bigger. She could have warned them. Instead, she watched, not from cruelty but exhaustion. Every warning she'd ever given had become a weapon in someone else's hand. In 2001, the world changed, and finance changed with it. The age of secrecy she had mastered was replaced by surveillance disguised as transparency. Algorithms no longer served strategy. They dictated it. Eleanor began to vanish from her own world, replaced by systems that replicated her logic without her restraint. Power had finally gone fully mechanical. And the machine never slept, never doubted, never forgave. For the first time, she made a mistake. A quiet hedge fund in Geneva, using one of her derivative models, imploded overnight. 40 billion vanished. Regulators whispered her name, then buried it. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she walked to the lake the next morning and stood watching her reflection ripple until dawn erased it. It wasn't guilt she felt. It was understanding. Control had never been about markets. It had always been about herself. And she had finally lost both. In silence, she began erasing herself, closing accounts, canceling addresses, shredding documents until her legacy became myth. But the system she built no longer needed her name. It had learned her rhythm, her logic, her patience. Markets now breathed as she once thought. Even as she disappeared, her shadow expanded. That is the cost of creating something powerful enough to outlive you. The moment it no longer remembers who gave it life. No obituary was ever written. No memorials, no whispers of retirement. Eleanor simply stopped existing on paper, yet her models didn't. When the global financial crisis erupted in 2008, the same equations she wrote 2 decades earlier began surfacing in emergency liquidity models across continents. Traders called it coincidence. Analysts called it prophecy. But those who remembered her, the very few, knew it was design. Eleanor had vanished, but her mathematics had evolved. Her ghost was back, dressed as a rescue plan. Somewhere in the depths of digital ledgers, her name began to reappear. Embedded in code, initials hidden in encryption keys, footnotes buried in patent filings. Tech firms whispered of Project Voss, an algorithmic stabilizer designed to predict market panic before it began. They didn't know she wrote it by hand. Years earlier, as a safeguard against human greed, now the machine guarded a system that had devoured its creator. Whispers of her presence returned through encrypted chat rooms. The architect lives. Hedge fund analysts passed her theories like contraband. An anonymous file circulated worldwide titled "The Ghost in the Market," containing equations no algorithm could fully solve. Her patterns predicted volatility with eerie precision, yet no one could replicate her restraint. The machine had inherited her genius, but none of her humanity. But legends can't stay contained. In 2014, a young journalist uncovered her trail. bank records that shouldn't exist, timestamps with no author, trades made milliseconds before announcements. He claimed he'd found her signature buried in high-frequency code. What he didn't know was that she'd written herself into it deliberately, a mathematical fingerprint ensuring her story could never be erased, only rediscovered. And then, a final transmission. An unsigned, encrypted file sent to 10 global banks, time-stamped exactly at midnight GMT. It contained only one line: "Markets remember their makers." Within hours, trading algorithms across continents froze for 11 minutes. The world's first collective pause in digital finance. Some called it a glitch, others called it a warning. But those who'd studied her work knew the truth. Eleanor Vos had found her way back into the system she once ruled. Not as a person, but as an idea. After the pause of 2015, global markets never fully trusted their systems again. Confidence, the invisible engine of finance, had fractured. But in the quiet of that doubt, a new generation began whispering her name, not as a rumor, but as a doctrine. They studied her models not for profit, but for balance, to understand the equilibrium between greed and grace. The world that once dismissed her restraint now worshipped it. In absence, Eleanor Vos had become the moral compass of a machine age that had lost its humanity. Her models began to resurface in unexpected places: university lectures, blockchain startups, even small co-ops in remote economies. The new financiers spoke of her, not as a strategist, but as a philosopher. They said she taught them that value was a language, not a weapon, that profit, without meaning, decays into panic. In the ruins of a system she helped build, her ideas became blueprints for redemption. Her rediscovery became a quiet revolution. Small firms began modeling their algorithms on empathy metrics, simulating fairness, sustainability, and trust. Governments took notice. So did the old institutions that once silenced her. They began calling it Vos equilibrium. But those who truly understood her work knew she hadn't created a formula for money. She'd created one for conscience. But myths demand sacrifice. The more her ideals spread, the more others tried to own them. Corporations trademarked her name. Investors branded her theories. The morality she'd inspired was once again monetized. Yet somewhere deep in encrypted archives, a forgotten failsafe she wrote decades ago began to awaken. A digital signature designed to erase any entity that tried to profit from her name. The market trembled once more, this time not from greed, but from justice. And then, silence again. The digital failsafe completed its work, dissolving every record of ownership tied to her name. For the second time, Eleanor disappeared. Not in body, but in principle. The markets recovered, calmer, humbler. Confidence returned not as speculation, but as stewardship. No one could claim her legacy because she had left none to claim. In erasing herself, Eleanor Vos completed her final act, proving that the most powerful kind of wealth is the kind that cannot be owned. Years after her final disappearance, a quiet shift began. Her teachings, distilled from half-remembered lectures and encrypted manuscripts, evolved into a living code known as the legacy algorithm. It wasn't designed to make anyone rich. It was designed to keep everyone honest. It audited greed itself, balancing human intent with digital precision. No one claimed authorship. No one needed to. The world had begun to run on an invisible principle. Trust measured, weighted, and self-correcting. Eleanor's dream, reborn as global infrastructure. Markets adapted. For the first time, the system could sense panic before it spread. Not by numbers, but by tone. By emotion embedded in trades. It rewarded patience, punished deception, and adjusted interest rates in real time to reflect global sentiment. The balance she once described on paper now breathed autonomously, protecting nations from collapse, shielding people from ruin. Finance had grown a conscience, and in every code fragment lay a whisper of the woman who gave it life. But no algorithm could contain the essence of humanity she once preserved. As the system grew, some feared it was too perfect, too detached. A generation of traders who'd never seen crisis began to question the cost of perpetual stability. Eleanor had designed markets to teach humility through failure. Without chaos, could people still learn? Her absence became a question the system couldn't answer. Proof that perfection without imperfection is simply another kind of collapse. Her followers formed an institute, the House of Equilibrium, where economists, coders, and philosophers worked side by side. They didn't teach profit, they taught patience. They studied not fluctuations, but motives. They believed Eleanor's final lesson wasn't how to predict markets, but how to deserve them. Every student carried a single creed engraved in glass above the entrance. Confidence is faith, made measurable. By 2032, her principles governed every major financial system on Earth. And yet, no one spoke of Eleanor Vos as a person anymore. She had become something purer, a pulse beneath global commerce, the conscience of capital. The markets she once tamed now moved in harmony, self-aware yet fragile, human again through her design. Somewhere in Zurich, under quiet rain, her last home remained untouched. A single candle still on the desk, flickering faintly against the glass. The architect's light, still measuring time. By the mid-2030s, the name Eleanor Vos had become myth, then symbol, then silence. The legacy algorithm had stabilized global markets so completely that volatility became history. Economists called it peace. Philosophers called it paralysis. But in the hum of stability, a new question arose. What is wealth without uncertainty? Her final lesson was not about numbers. It was about risk, the heartbeat of meaning. Without it, even perfection loses value. Humanity began to miss the tremor, the unpredictability that made trust sacred. They realized she hadn't built a machine to end chaos. She built one to remind them why they needed it. When the first self-correcting market cycle completed, the system released a final message, a single line in Eleanor's handwriting, stored decades earlier. You cannot automate belief. It became the most studied sentence in financial history. The world finally understood. Markets had always been mirrors of emotion, faith quantified through risk. Eleanor's work was never about control. It was about teaching people how to trust the invisible again. Across universities, temples, and trading floors, her writings became scripture, not of finance, but of philosophy. People no longer studied wealth as accumulation, but as circulation, trust moving through time, sustained by memory. In that truth, Eleanor's life found completion. She hadn't built systems of numbers, but systems of meaning. The invisible became sacred again, and value rediscovered its pulse. Her Zurich home became a museum, a sanctuary for those who sought wisdom in silence. Visitors described an unexplainable feeling when entering her study, as if the air itself remembered thought. On the desk, her pocket watch still ticked, synchronized with the algorithmic heartbeat of the global economy. The world moved in rhythm with the same quiet pulse that once beat beneath her hand. The architect was gone, but the design had learned to dream. And then, but this time, it wasn't absence. It was completion. The woman who once balanced the fear of nations had become something larger than legacy. She had become equilibrium itself. The final equation wasn't written in code or capital. It was written in humanity's newfound calm. Somewhere, beyond numbers and noise, Eleanor Vos endures, the invisible pulse of faith made measurable.